Hello, everyone. We're talking with Bill Jennings, who is a senior director at Delta Consulting Group. Hello, Bill. How are you?
I'm great, Hernan. Good to see you again.
Nice to see you as well. So, your expertise, or one of them anyway, is in fraud and forensics. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. I spent 40 years doing that. So,
Absolutely. Yes. I know that you have an extensive background when it comes to these topics and compliance and government regulations and so on. So let's hone in on this piece in terms of the fraud and forensics aspect of your background. And what are some of the things that are happening in that space that internal auditors and compliance professionals should be on the lookout for? What's happening?
I think fraud is fraud. It takes different forms. Interestingly, I told you about this conference I was at last week, the White Collar Crime Institute, Miami. There was a man there who I put in prison 20 years ago. And he was an executive at MCI and was engaged in a rather massive lending fraud. And of course, we don't have time to talk through all of it. But interestingly, he's got a company now that he calls Prisonology, where you might think of it as sort of the real world manifestation of that movie. I think it was called Get Hard, where Will Ferrell was going to prison as a white collar criminal, and Kevin Hart was preparing him. So that's what this guy does now, and he's actually very good at it. But interestingly, he was talking about FTX. And this is a guy who knows, right? He is a very experienced fraudster himself. And he said, the government keeps talking about this like it's something real, like something actually, commercially viable actually happened. He said, it's a fraud. So in that sense, fraud is eternal. It's getting someone to rely on a false representation that ultimately results in harm to them. And so that in that way, the world is the same as it always was. But the way that we lure people into relying on things has changed. And so what's happened is, we're talking in an earlier segment about blockchain assets. So it's obviously a very useful technology, a technology that opens us up to infinite new opportunities in terms of human creation of intellectual property, but also exposes us to a new type of fraud. And so, I think the one thing that remains constant is fraud will occur wherever the opportunity exists. Human beings are always looking for opportunities to exploit new areas to lure people into relying on things that are simply not true.
So when it comes to blockchain, one of the selling points of it is the fact that because of the way it's built, the blocks and how it's all connected, how it's very limited opportunity, let's call it limited opportunity to make any changes to it. In some cases, people say you cannot make any change unless everybody agrees to it. With that and a few other safety measures built into the algorithms and the procedures, that is virtually impossible to do. So what are some of the ways that people are getting around that to be able to engage in fraud anyway?
There's a recent example of a type of cryptocurrency, and I think I may have the name wrong, but I believe it was called OneCoin.
Okay.
And OneCoin collapsed entirely, costing people tens of millions of dollars, and maybe hundreds of millions. Even the name OneCoin was a fraud because there wasn't even one coin. So
they just basically pretended to create this asset or this currency. They pretended to create it, collected money from people, but there was no intention of ever following up or living up to the promises made.
Yeah, because the thing is that blockchain, of course, is a tremendous tool to allow people to create currencies or securities, valuable intellectual property, and protect it in a totally unique way that's entirely verifiable. And so let's set that on one side. When was the last time you verified the blockchain identifier for any digital asset? When was the last time you did that?
I guess a lot of people will say that it's a matter of trust to some extent, right? That you
Exactly.
hear about it and you
That's
say,
what the
okay, yes,
fraudsters count
feels legitimate. Okay, so is that along the same lines then of an individual who can take the assets. So even if they were going to create it, so we already put aside the example of someone who says they were going to, but they're never going to follow up on it. But those who did create it, and then they will take the money and siphon off the money or engage in some kind of a Ponzi scheme type of an arrangement where they take some money for their own use, but it doesn't get moved into the stakeholders' accounts like they should have been. So is these some examples of the types of fraud that are occurring?
Yeah, this is as old as time. So this goes back to the beginning of my career. The first fraud investigation I ever did was in 1980. And it was a financial institution that engaged in a type of affinity fraud where when people would come to this country from Croatia, the people who owned the financial institution were also from Croatia, and they would get these people jobs in exchange for the people then depositing their money at the financial institution. Everything rocked along fine. All of these people were engaged actually in the fishing industry until we got to the oil crisis in the late 1970s. And the largest raw material for the fisheries industry in terms of cost is fuel, diesel fuel. And so those diesel fuel prices went through the roof. Well, because all these people were in that industry, they came to the financial institution to withdraw the money, and it wasn't there. They believed it was there because they were sent statements every month showing that the money was there, and they relied on those, and everything rocked along swimmingly as long as no one was trying to withdraw large amounts of money. But then the oil crisis caused everyone to basically make a run on the bank, and the cash was all gone because it had been stolen by the people who own the financial institution. Now that sounds like an antiquated example, doesn't it? It sounds like, oh, gee, that's very quaint. That happened 100 years ago when Moses was a young man.
But I think that's to some extent what happened with FTX, wasn't it?
Exactly.
That's similar to what happened
to today. It's exactly the same thing. All of those people believed the representations that were made in terms of digital statements produced by FTX regarding their digital assets. But in fact, those assets weren't there. They had been, we don't know yet because the investigation hasn't been done, but they clearly were not available to the people who believe that they own them. So the point I'm trying to make is that the nature of fraud doesn't change, the opportunities change. And I think the new opportunity is in blockchain. Now, I think we're going to get better. I think there are going to be easier, better methods to validate blockchain assets. But as of today, people are still being defrauded by, what are relatively, simple schemes, frankly.
So Bill, one of the questions that I have then, because you're right, and before that we had Madoff, and I'm just kind of mentioning some of these very large type of frauds that took place over the last few decades. But then if we're looking at some of this, then the process of confirmations, which is one of the controls that you will expect, and then of course some kind of regulation and government oversight that will then review financial statements and verify that the assets are in fact where they are and they're valid as they claim they are. Do we see then that the government is starting to oversee some of these things? But more importantly, let's talk about, maybe not more importantly, but how about third parties? Do we have are we seeing some kind of a mechanism emerging where we have the equivalent of the public accounting firms doing that kind of review to determine if those assets really exist and they are held in a secure way?
Yes, but what it lacks is general acceptance or regulatory, robust regulatory oversight. So on the regulatory side, again, as I mentioned earlier, the regulators are sort of waiting on Congress to create some definitions for these things, legal definitions, that will allow them to, more clearly exercise their regulatory authority. On the other side, there are a variety of certifications now available for people who would be auditors of blockchain assets. But as far as I am aware at the moment, there's no general acceptance in terms of the curricula that are used or the principles that are being taught. So it's a bit of a crazy quilt at the moment. So there's there's no, as far as I can tell, there's no Institute of Internal Auditors related to blockchain technology or anything of that sort. So we'll see. I mean, I think that's going to emerge, but it doesn't exist yet. And can I mention one other thing really quickly? A lot of the problem, Hernan, it relates to human nature. So there are a couple of things at play. One is, and it's something I see in my work. Do you know what people tell me when I show up to begin an investigation? This has happened every single time for the last 40 years. They always say, "I'm sorry we had to meet under these circumstances." And I often think, well, I'm not, because this is how I earn my living. But the next thing that they tell me is when I identify a subject or a target in an investigation and begin to ask questions about that person, I always get the same reaction from colleagues and coworkers. That person couldn't possibly be involved in anything like that. The most extreme example was a guy who, there was a terrible accident at an engineering company in Minnesota that was owned by a French company, and the guy who was the president was killed.
Bill, let's take a quick break, but don't lose your train of thought, because I really want to hear about this. But let's take a short break, and then when we come back, we'll talk about it. Absolutely, yes. We'll be right back.
Tired of trying to schedule your team's time around in-person learning? Isn't it a bummer to spend thousands of dollars on travel for professional development? What if we said you can save money and time and still provide your team with the best training possible? The answer to your woes is live online training from ACI Learning. With live online training, we provide our top in-person courses in private, online, instructor-led formats. You get to provide professional development in a manner that fits today's expectations. Entertaining, convenient, and effective. Our exam-aligned courses inspire the full potential of your team. Visit virtual instructor-led training at ACI Learning for more info.
Welcome back, everyone. And Bill, right before the break, you were telling us about an incident that occurred in Minnesota. So what happened there?
Yeah, so there was a terrible accident where the president of a French-owned engineering firm in Minnesota was killed, and they had to recruit and hire a replacement. And shortly after they hired the replacement, the company literally went off the rails. All of their financial results turned down, and it was just a mess. And so they wanted to find out, the French company wanted to find out what had happened. So they hired us to do an investigation, internal investigation. And the first thing we always do in a case like that is we identify any changes that have occurred. The obvious change was they hired this new president. And if it's a personnel change like that, the first thing we do is a background check, which we did on this guy. And the background check revealed that none of the things that he put on his resume could be verified. The universities he said he attended had no record of him. He said he had served in the U.S. military as a helicopter pilot. They had no record of him. So we stopped, because we didn't want to waste the client's money, and went to the general counsel and said, "Hey, we think we've identified your problem. This guy is a fraud. None of his information checks out." And the general counsel said, "That's impossible." I hear this a lot. And we said, well, why is that impossible? Well, I personally verified some of the information. In fact, there was a History Channel episode about helicopter pilots, Army helicopter pilots who flew in Vietnam. And a number of the people here saw him in that History Channel episode and told me about it. So, okay, well, we could be wrong. Who told you that? So he tells us, we go interview those people, and they all said the same thing. Oh, yeah, he paid us to tell people that. We were wondering when somebody was going to come asking about it. So the point that I'm making is that all of us, all human beings, have this, we're herd animals. So we have this sort of internal bias that says, what does it say about me as a person if I have a colleague who is a criminal? I mean, that's basically it. What terrible thing does that say about me if I have a colleague who's a criminal and I'm associated with that person? So that's the first thing that happens. The other thing that happens is we have this strange bias to avoid recognizing errors when we make them. So we will make a decision, and then the decision goes badly. And instead of recognizing that and stopping and taking a different action, we double down. We invest more in the bad decision, and then it gets worse. And this, incidentally, accounts for a lot of financial statement fraud. That's where it all starts. I mean, I heard the guy who was an audit committee member or a board member, I guess, when the Mercury Finance thing happened. And of course, that was a massive audit failure. It was Arthur Anderson client. And it all started because they were going to miss the quarterly earnings number that the CEO had given to Wall Street by $1 million. It was a relatively small amount of money. And the CFO, who had a child with health problems that were so severe that he was concerned that if he ever lost his job, he'd never be able to replace the health insurance coverage. And so he wanted, in every way possible to please the CEO. So he comes to the CEO and says, we're not going to make it. We're short $1 million. And the CEO says, that's the wrong answer. And so the guy,
make it somehow.
Yeah, the guy goes and makes an topside entry, and he kept, incidentally, a list of the topside entries in his desk drawer. I don't know why people do this. They keep records of their criminal conduct. But anyway, I'm certain.
Sometimes they're trying to keep their story straight because maybe next quarter they'll have to come back and make another adjustment on the following one, so they have to keep track of the numbers and the journal entries that they used and whatever mechanism they followed. But they want to create a story that sounds plausible and to in their minds defensible, right?
And the reason I'm saying these things, Hernan, is for the internal auditors who will see this. The one thing I want you to realize is that while technologies change, and as a result, opportunities for fraud change, the underlying human behavioral characteristics remain very consistent. That those don't change. Those are the same.
Bill, on that note, Bill, what will you suggest people who are contemplating entering this field of fraud and forensics from a career perspective? And what kind of advice will you give them so that they can build their career and get their right footing as they build this?
Well, the first thing I would tell them is I worked on a public corruption investigation years ago with the guy who's now the director of the FBI. And there was a FBI agent named Oliver Halley who worked on that investigation as well. And we successfully prosecuted the guy, and he went to prison. But Oliver developed a program that he called Corporate Scared Straight, where he would, after he retired from the FBI, take people who had been convicted of white-collar crimes and have them talk about their crimes in front of, corporate audiences to explain to them how they got involved in the crime and then the consequences of it. But in his materials, he quotes from the West Point Cadets prayer. And the quote is, God, please give me the strength to make the hard right choice in favor of the easy wrong choice. And that's the first thing I would say, that nothing is more important than your reputation. So if you're going to enter this career, realize that you're going to be challenged. People are going to challenge your findings, your investigative findings, and you're going to be put under pressure to make that easy wrong choice. Don't do it. It's not worth it.
So courage to stand for what's right, integrity.
Exactly. That's first. And then second, trust everyone, but be skeptical. Verify. And if something appears to be out of line, it often means that something has happened. So don't ignore anomalies. Don't write them off as some minor thing that you don't have to pay attention to. Even if it's relatively small, make sure you understand what caused it. I
skepticism so being skeptical and also following your instinct to some extent. Now, question about certifications and credentials. What credentials would you recommend? And I know there are quite a few to choose from, but what are some thoughts?
Well, of course, I think the Institute of Internal Auditors is critically important, and so that credential is extraordinarily important to be a certified internal auditor. Other ones that I think are useful that are gaining some traction are the I hope I get the initials right. I think it's CGMA.
Government management.
Yeah, right. Management accountant, certified management accountant.
Certified management accountant, CMA, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's important because of the skill sets that are addressed. And then, of course, because of the ways in which technology is exploding, I think it's important also to have, depending on your focus, appropriate credentialing easy for me to say, credentialing in the audit of what we'll call electronic data, because it's such a broad area. And there are a variety of credentials. It really depends on what your focus ultimately is going to be. But I think that's important as well. The one thing I would say is, I don't think this comes up so much for internal auditors, but if you were to more narrowly engage in fraud investigation and were going to make yourself available to be hired in that role where you would be potentially testifying in court, the CPA is a valuable credential because it actually is a license that's issued by state governments. And so the courts pay a lot of attention to that for that reason. And then the other credential that's pretty widely recognized is the Certified Fraud Examiner credential that's issued by the CFE.
You wrote a book, correct? As we're wrapping up, right? Is that correct?
I did. The title of the book is Fraud Investigation, Forensic Accounting in the Real World. And my tagline for the book is, for everybody who's getting into this field, this is the textbook I wish I had 40 years ago when I started.
All right. Very good. Very good. Well, thank you very much, Bill. It was a pleasure chatting with you today. Thank you.
You too, Hernan. Thank you.